In the aftermath of the War of the Ring, with Sauron vanquished and his reign of terror shattered, a haunting question lingers for many fans. What fate befell the Dark Lord's spirit once the ring was destroyed? Sauron was no mere mortal. He was a being of ancient lineage, blessed with an immortal spirit that could never be fully extinguished. Yet, for all his might, Sauron was not impervious to the ravages of war, and in his hubris, in his insatiable thirst for control, Sauron sealed his own fate. He poured much of his spirit into the One Ring, which would become his undoing. As the fires of Mount Doom consumed the ring, so too did they consume the corporeal form that housed Sauron's malice. But what became of the remainder of Sauron's spirit and his remaining power once the One Ring met its fiery demise? Could it be that the spirit of Sauron endures, a spectre haunting the shadows, biding its time until the evil things begin to stir once more? Join me as we journey into the heart of Middle-earth, where the echoes of Sauron's legacy still resonate and the whispers of his spirit linger on the wind. In order to understand the essence of Sauron's spirit, we must first return to the luminous dawn of time itself. In the unfathomable expanse of the timeless void, there dwelled Eru Ilúvatar, the one who is the essence of all things. From the boundless brilliance of his mind, he wove the fabric of reality, a grand tapestry of existence, each thread bearing the mark of his divine hand. First he created the Ainur, the Holy Ones, spirits born of his thought and imbued with the power of song. The Ainur made the great music, called the Ainulindale. In this cosmic melody, the world was envisioned, and among the Ainur existed the spirit that would one day be known as Sauron. Some of the Ainur chose to descend into Arda in order to shape the world. The mightiest of these Ainur, known as the Valar, were entrusted with the stewardship of the world, and the Maiar, their lesser kin, served the Valar, and embodied aspects of their master's power and wisdom. Sauron was one of these Maiar, a servant and student of the Valar Owl the Smith, though he would betray his master by joining forces with Melkor, the original Dark Lord. Due to these beginnings, Sauron's undying spirit is forever bound to Arda, a malevolent flame of malice, flickering endlessly, never to truly be extinguished. According to Tolkien's mythology, every sentient being possesses an immortal soul. Therefore, when they are killed, it is not a true end, but rather the release of the soul from its mortal vessel, liberating it to transcend beyond the physical realm. When men die, their spirit passes beyond the circles of the world into the unknown. Not even the Valar possess the knowledge of what lies beyond. For mortals, the end is resolute and inescapable. When an elf meets their end, their spirit journeys to the halls of Mandos, where it finds respite and reflection. After a time of quiet renewal, they are bestowed with a new body, which is physically identical to their previous form. The sting of death is still sharp for the elves. It is shocking, unpleasant, and it brings about a prolonged parting from those they hold dear, making it something that they still seek to evade. Spiritual beings such as Sauron, however, are naturally formless spirits. When they wish to take physical form in order to interact with the physical world, they are able to take on a body by choice. This form is known as a Fana. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by love of the children of Ilúvatar, for whom they hoped they took shape, after that manner which they had beheld in the vision of Ilúvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. And they needed not, save only as we use raiment, and yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore the Valar may walk if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male, and some as of female. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Ilúvatar, for at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought made visible in forms of majesty and dread. To the Ainur, physical forms are akin to garments, donned to traverse the world and engage with its inhabitants. These bodies are but vessels and are not entwined with their essence. However, it is essential to recognize that their forms are real and tangible, and prolonged use can lead them to be cherished deeply by the spirit that dwells within them. The Fana of the Vala were not phantoms, but physical. That is, they were not visions arising to the mind or implanted there by the will of a superior mind or spirit, and then projected but received through the bodily eyes. When an Ainu inhabits one of these physical vessels for an extended time, their soul begins to weave itself into the essence of the form, creating a profound emotional bond that deepens into a psychological dependency. The longer they remain intertwined with the vessel, the more their spirit and flesh merge, pulling the Ainu deeper into the embrace of the material world. This connection intensifies as they indulge in earthly pleasures. The delights of the flesh, the warmth of a hearty meal, the cool refreshment of a drink all become more than mere sustenance. They become a symphony of sensations that bind the Ainu ever closer to their Fana. Though in origin a self-arraying form, it may tend to approach the state of incarnation, especially with the lesser members of that order, the Maiar. It is said that the longer and the more the same Haroa is used, the greater is the bond of habit, and the less do the self-arrayed desire to leave it, as raiment may soon cease to be an adornment and becomes, as is said in the Elves and Men, a habit, a customary garb. Or if among elves and men it be worn to mitigate hot or cold, it soon makes the clad body less able to endure these things when naked. If the spirit, that is, one of those not embodied by creation, uses a Haroa for the furtherance of its personal purposes, or still more, for the enjoyment of bodily faculties, it finds it increasingly difficult to operate without the Haroa. The things that are most binding are those that in the incarnate have to do with the life of the Haroa itself, its substance, and its propagation. Thus eating and drinking are binding, but not the delight in beauty in sound or form. Most binding is begetting or conceiving. The Vala, in their celestial grace, are known to indulge in feasts and libations on occasion, relishing these joys in moderation without becoming bound to their earthly vessels. It is when the Fana is wielded too frequently or with too much fervor that the bond appears to deepen and intensify at an accelerated pace. As the previous quote conveys, the act of procreation profoundly anchors a spirit to its Fana. This truth shines brightly in the tale of Melian, a Maya whose heart was captivated by the elven king, Elu Thingol. Through their love and the birth of their daughter, Melian became inexorably tethered to her earthly form, and there may be other, more sinister ways in which an Ainu may become bound to their Fana. Although it is not explicitly stated, there are tales that hint at the tethering that transpires when dark deeds stain the soul. Melkor had turned back, and in secrecy passed away far to the south, for he was yet as one of the Valar, and could change his form, or walk unclad as could his brethren, though that power he was soon to lose forever. Thus unseen, he came at last to the dark region of Avathar. There, beneath the sheer walls of mountains and the cold, dark sea, the shadows were deepest and thickest in the world, and there in Avathar, secret and unknown, Ungoliant, had made her abode. In a ravine she lived, and took shape as a spider of monstrous form, weaving her black webs in a cleft of the mountains. There she sucked up all light that she could find, and spun it forth again in dark nets of strangling gloom, until no light more could come to her abode, and she was famished. Now Melkor came to Avathar and sought her out, and he put on again the form that he had worn as the tyrant of Utumno, a dark lord, tall and terrible. In that form he remained ever after. Melkor recruited Through this menacing alliance, he sought to quench the very light that bathed and enriched the surrounding lands and peoples. Yet, in the aftermath of this heinous deed, Melkor found himself ensnared, forever bound in his mortal guise, a prisoner of his own malevolence. He could no longer mend the many scars he bore. The flesh of his hand remained seared from grasping the Silmarils, his foot remained crippled by Fingolfin's strike. And the scar etched across his face by Thorondor's talon would endure. It was then made plain, though it must have been understood beforehand by Manwë and Namo, that though Melkor had disseminated his power, his evil and possessive and rebellious will far and wide into the matter of Arda, he had lost direct control of this, and all that he, as a surviving remnant of integral being retained as himself and under control, was the terribly shrunken and reduced spirit that inhabited his self-imposed but now beloved body. When that body was destroyed, he was weak and utterly houseless, and for that time at a loss and unanchored as it were. For an incarnate Ainur, the loss of their physical form through death can be a harrowing ordeal. The jarring absence of what once defined their very essence leaves them adrift in a sea of confusion, detached from the world for an agonizing span. When Sauron met his demise in the cataclysm of Númenor's downfall, it took a decade for him to rebuild his form, and following his second defeat at the hands of the last alliance of men and elves, it took over 1,000 years for him to rise once more. In an echo of Melkor's plight, Sauron too would find himself ensnared within the confines of mortal flesh. Just as Melkor's essence was shackled after marring Valinor's brilliance, so too did Sauron's spirit become incarnate in the wake of Númenor's downfall. There came a mighty wind, and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea with all its children and its wives and its maidens and its ladies proud, and all its gardens and its halls and its towers, its tombs and its riches, and its jewels and its webs and its things painted and carven, and its laughter and its mirth and its music, its wisdom and its lore, they vanished forever. Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar and the doom that Eru laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenorians and the defeat of their proud king. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep, and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor, that was his home. In the dawn of his self-resurrection, Sauron emerged with flesh anew. Thus exposed, he became susceptible to the weapons of mortals. But before these events would unfold, and while he still possessed the ability to change his form, he would wield his abilities as a shapeshifter to terrible effect. Throughout the First and Second Ages, he wove his schemes with deft mastery, for the craft of shifting guise and donning fair semblance would allow him to ensnare the children of Ilúvatar and trick the elves into the crafting of the Rings of Power. In the year 1200, Sauron, cloaked in fair form and naming himself Anatar, came to the elves of Eregion. With his veiled identity, he weaved his way into the hearts of the elves, convincing them to craft the Rings of Power with their own hands. Around 400 years later in Mordor, within the blazing crucible known as the Cracks of Doom, Sauron wrought his master ring, an act that sealed his destiny and bestowed upon him the enduring title of the Lord of the Rings. The idea of pouring spiritual power into physical matter is not a new one. In the pages of Morgoth's Ring, we are told of the marring of Arda, as it was tainted by the malevolent touch of Melkor. His aim was to weave his spirit into the very matter of which Arda was formed. He had to sacrifice much of his power in order to achieve this dread fusion. In return, he left an indelible stain on the material realm, casting a shadow that gripped the world in an unyielding hold. But in this way, Morgoth lost, or exchanged or transmuted the greater part of his original angelic powers of mind and spirit, while gaining a terrible grip upon the physical world. For this reason, he had to be fought, mainly by physical force, and enormous material ruin was a probable consequence of any direct combat with him, victorious or otherwise. This is the chief explanation of the constant reluctance of the Valar to come into open battle against Morgoth. This process would have been similar for Sauron. A large portion of his power and spirit were transmuted into the ring. This power exchange was required in order to exert his dominion over all of the other rings. Yet the act of binding such immense power within the ring created the vulnerability, the fatal flaw in his armor, which would lead to his destruction. But it also meant that as long as the ring existed, Sauron's spirit would endure. The ring's very existence, although Sauron didn't physically possess the ring, meant that his spirit and his magic was alive and well. Sauron would, before long, invoke yet another guise, naming himself Zigur the Great. Empowered by his freshly forged ring, he swiftly rose to become a formidable king in Middle-earth. Men rallied to his side, fought under his banner, and pledged their service to him. In his brazen vanity, Sauron adorned himself with a cascade of grandiose titles, each more glorifying than the last. The King of Men, the Lord of the Earth, the Lord of the World, and most audaciously, the King of Kings. This final, most vainglorious claim enraged Ar-Pharazôn, the mighty ruler of Númenor, provoking him to wage war against Sauron. The might of Númenor proved too great for Sauron's forces. Sauron was captured and delivered to the shores of Númenor. Here, with cunning words and dark persuasion, Sauron deceived Ar-Pharazôn and the men of Númenor, leading them down the shadowed path of Melkor worship. Then, with whispered promises of eternal life, he guided the monarch into rebellion against the divine order, urging an assault upon the sacred shores of Valinor. It was at this time, as the ships of the Númenorian fleet arrived upon the shores of Aman, that Eru Ilúvatar intervened. Then Manwë upon the mountain called upon Ilúvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world. And a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the Deathless Lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken, and all the fleets of the Númenorians were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn, the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman, were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten, until the last battle and the day of doom. As Númenor descended into the abyss, Sauron's bodily form perished, yet his spirit, undeterred, fled back to Middle-earth, seeking refuge in the ominous fortress of Barad-dûr. Here he would find that he could no longer alter his form. He was now imprisoned in the grim visage that he had crafted for himself, forever bound as the Dark Lord, yet his spirit arose out of the deep and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor. That was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr and dwelt there, dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible in the eye of Sauron the Terrible. Few could endure. There lies a belief within the fan community that this loss of shape-shifting ability is due to a simple loss of power. The concept that Sauron grew weaker with each defeat, emerging diminished after every fall, echoes widely through the lore community. Yet Gandalf reveals that, if Sauron had reclaimed the ring in the Third Age, his strength would have surged, making him mightier than ever before. He only needs the one, for he made that ring himself. It is his, and he let a great part of his own former power pass into it so that he could rule all the others. If he recovers it, then he will command them all again, wherever they be. even the three, and all that has been wrought with them will be laid bare, and he will be stronger than ever. Yet, in a profound shift, his essence intertwined with the mortal coil, rendering him vulnerable, though perhaps no less dangerous. In the embrace of corporeal form, Sauron would have been forced to surrender to many of the constraints of mortality. No longer could his spirit soar through the realms with effortless fluidity, nor deceive those who he wished to corrupt with the veil of his fair form. In this way, he was certainly weakened, and he would now fear the destruction of his body more keenly than ever before. It is for this reason that he sought refuge within the vast fortress of Barad-dûr, while the last alliance entered into Mordor and there laid siege to the Dark Tower. For 7 long years, he lingered within its depths, ensconced in the grip of fear as the last alliance lingered in his dark domain. Then, Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years, and suffered grievous loss by fire and by the darts and bolts of the enemy. And Sauron sent many sorties against them. There, in the valley of Gorgoroth, Inarion son of Elendil was slain, and many others. But at the last, the siege was so strait that Sauron himself came forth. And he wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil, and they both were slain, and the sword of Elendil broke under him as he fell. But Sauron also was thrown down, and with the hilt shard of Narsil, Isildur cut the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron and took it for his own. Then Sauron was for that time vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places. And he took no visible shape again for many long years. By mortally wounding Sauron, they rent his spirit from its vessel, a grievous blow that surely exacted a heavy toll upon the Dark Lord, leaving him deeply wounded. However, he wasn't merely separated from his body, he was torn from something even more precious, as Isildur took up his father's broken sword and cut the ring from Sauron's black hand. The absence of the ring would strip Sauron of his ability to amplify his dark powers, leaving him profoundly diminished and inflicting upon him a wound that would fester and never heal. But to achieve this, he had been obliged to let a great part of his own inherent power, a frequent and very significant motive in myth and fairy story, pass into the One Ring. While he wore it, his power on earth was actually enhanced. But even if he did not wear it, that power existed and was in rapport with himself. He was not diminished unless some other seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron, become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place. Sauron was weakened in the sense that his power was no longer magnified by the ring, and he greatly feared another who could challenge him, such as Aragorn, laying claim to the ring and using it against him. But Isildur would soon die, and the ring would lay hidden in the waters of Anduin for 2,461 years. Therefore, with the ring still in existence, hidden and unclaimed, Sauron was able to rebuild his strength, and the world would feel the chill of his menacing shadow once more. Despite the ring's absence, Sauron remained a formidable force. Though his defeats had slowed his return, the year 1050 of the Third Age marked the resurgence of his dark presence. It seemed that the evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to reappear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said. From there, the power was spreading far and wide, and away far east and south, there were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. He materialized once more, crafting his body anew, and it became evident that Sauron now bore the scars of his ordeals. For after reconstructing his body, he would discover that he could not restore the finger that Isildur took from him. Despite bearing the evidence of this ancient wound, if he was simply able to recover his lost ring, he would have been such a force in the world that none among the free peoples of Middle-earth would have had the strength to now stand against him. Concerning this thing, my lords, you now all know enough for the understanding of our plight and of Sauron's. If he regains it, your valor is vain, and his victory will be swift and complete. So complete that none can foresee the end of it while this world lasts. Upon reclaiming the ring, Sauron would rise to unparalleled might in Middle-earth, where his reign would be absolute, and all would bend to his will under the weight of their despair. Of course, Sauron would forever be severed from that part of himself which he poured into his ring, doomed instead to watch on as the ring fell into the fires of Mount Doom. And, in the vivid recounting of Sauron's demise, Tolkien gifts us with tantalizing hints about the Dark Lord's ultimate fate. Stand, men of the West. Stand and wait. This is the hour of doom. And even as he spoke, the earth rocked beneath their feet. Then, rising swiftly up, far above the towers of the Black Gate, high above the mountains, a vast soaring darkness sprang into the sky, flickering with fire. The earth groaned and quaked. The towers of the Teeth swayed, tottered and fell down. The mighty rampart crumbled. The Black Gate was hurled in ruin, and from far away, now dim, now growing, now mounting to the clouds, there came a drumming rumble, a roar, a long, echoing roll of ruinous noise. "The realm of Sauron is ended," said Gandalf. "The ring-bearer has fulfilled his quest." And as the captains gazed south to the land of Mordor, it seemed to them that, black against the pall of cloud, there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Enormous, it reared above the world and stretched out towards them a vast, threatening hand, terrible but impotent. But even as it leaned over them, a great wind took it, and it was all blown away and past. And then a hush fell. This passage reveals that with the destruction of the ring, all things that had been bound together by the will of Sauron collapsed in a cataclysm of chaos and disarray. The forces he commanded and the very lands he controlled disintegrated, releasing a torrent of upheaval that marked the end of his reign. Sauron then transformed into a colossal shadow, vast and consuming, stretching across the sky. His presence was like a storm, dark and terrible. He extended his grasp towards the ranks of men assembled before the Black Gate in a final act of malice.